It was just another morning in Judge John Hamilton's courtroom, a place where routine decisions were made, and the unassuming flow of justice carried on without much fanfare. The air inside the small, yet formal, space was still, save for the occasional shuffle of papers and the hum of muted voices. Judge Hamilton, in his mid-50s, had seen it all over his 2 decades on the bench. His stern demeanor had earned him respect from his peers, but also a reputation for being a no-nonsense figure in the local legal community. Rosa Matthews stepped into the courtroom, her eyes steady, her movements calm but deliberate. She was dressed in modest clothes, her posture erect as she waited for her case to be called. For most people, being in court was a nerve-wracking experience, but not for Rosa. She had experienced this many times in different forms, often as a leader in the legal field, advocating for change from behind the scenes. However, today was different. Today, she wasn't there as a figure of authority. She was just another person facing a minor charge, a simple traffic violation. The court had no idea who she really was. Judge Hamilton glanced at the docket as the clerk called her name. "Rosa Matthews," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent issuing commands in this very courtroom. He didn't look up from his papers as he gestured for her to step forward. Rosa walked up to the bench, her gaze steady and unwavering. It wasn't the first time she'd been in a courtroom, but it was the first time in this particular role. As she stood before him, she noticed the slight frown that creased the judge's forehead as he glanced down at her ticket. He didn't make any immediate eye contact. There was an almost mechanical quality to his movements as he took a moment to review the charge. Rosa stood silently, waiting for him to speak. She had dealt with this kind of situation before, being underestimated, being seen only for the surface-level facts. To some, her presence in this courtroom might have seemed ordinary. To her, though, it was a reminder of how often she had to prove herself in spaces where people didn't expect someone like her to hold power. Judge Hamilton finally looked up, his gaze briefly meeting hers. For a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but it quickly faded. Without hesitation, he spoke. "Ms. Matthews, you are charged with failing to stop at a stop sign. The fine for this violation is $200. Do you have anything to add?" Rosa's response was measured, a brief nod as she accepted the fine. "No, Your Honor." The judge, seemingly dismissive, issued his ruling quickly. "Fine is set. You may go." He didn't offer any further words, and with that, Rosa quietly turned and left the courtroom. As she walked out, the sound of the courtroom door clicking shut behind her felt heavy, almost as if it marked the end of a chapter. For Judge Hamilton, it was just another day. For Rosa, though, the moment lingered in the air. Little did either of them know. The small interaction would have a ripple effect neither of them could have anticipated. Judge John Hamilton had worked hard to earn his place in the legal world. His name was synonymous with respect in the courtroom, and over the years, his reputation had been carefully cultivated, built on years of steady, predictable rulings. He was known for his no-nonsense approach to justice, an adherence to the law that left little room for emotional influence or interpretation. Hamilton was a man of tradition, someone who valued stability in a legal system that, in his eyes, often veered too much toward modern ideals. His motto was simple: "The law is the law." Growing up in a middle-class family in a quiet suburban town, Hamilton had been instilled with a deep sense of duty and respect for the system that governed society. His parents were both educators, and their commitment to fairness and structure shaped his worldview from a young age. It wasn't surprising when he decided to study law, driven by a desire to uphold what he saw as a cornerstone of society's values. His ambition was clear. He would work his way through the ranks of the legal world, and one day, sit on the bench. His rise through the legal system was methodical. After law school, he quickly made a name for himself as a sharp prosecutor, winning case after case with his meticulous attention to detail and his unyielding belief in the rule of law. His colleagues respected him for his integrity, even if his rigidity sometimes alienated others. To Hamilton, The ends always justified the means. He didn't care for theatrics or the emotional appeals that some lawyers used in court. What mattered was the law, plain and simple. After years of hard work, Hamilton was appointed as a judge in the local district court. It was a coveted position, one that he had worked toward for years, and it came with an air of authority that was hard to ignore. The courtroom, a place where he had spent many hours as both a prosecutor and a defense attorney, now felt like his kingdom. With a gavel in hand, he could shape the course of legal proceedings with a simple ruling. His confidence was unshakable. He ran his court with precision. The cases he presided over were typically straightforward: traffic violations, petty crimes, small claims. He maintained order with a firm hand, rarely allowing personal stories or outside influences to affect his decisions. In Hamilton's mind, emotions had no place in the courtroom. His job was to interpret the law, not to sympathize with the parties involved. As far as he was concerned, the system worked as it should, and any attempt to change it was unnecessary. Despite his conservative views on the legal system, Hamilton wasn't without his admirers. Many saw him as a figure of authority who ensured that justice was administered with fairness, even if it lacked a personal touch. He had a consistent track record of rulings that reflected his belief in the letter of the law. However, those who worked closely with him often noted that while Hamilton was fair, he could be distant, somewhat aloof even. His sense of professionalism left little room for the nuances of individual circumstances. In his personal life, Judge Hamilton was just as reserved. He lived alone in a modest, well-kept house not far from the courthouse. His friends were few, and his social life was minimal. He had always preferred the company of books to people, and his evenings were often spent reading legal texts or preparing for the next day's cases. There was comfort in the predictability of his life. He knew what to expect every day. Work, reading, and an occasional meal at the local diner were the extent of his routine. It wasn't that Hamilton didn't care about the world outside of the courtroom. It's just that he believed in structure and order above all else. He had always viewed social changes with skepticism, believing that the judicial system worked best when left to its traditional ways. He hadn't seen much reason to question it. For him, everything had its place. The system was supposed to be impartial, and that's how he chose to view it. That's how he lived his life, by maintaining control over his environment, making sure everything stayed exactly where it was supposed to be. But all of that, all the years of carefully curated stability and adherence to tradition, would soon be tested by something unexpected: a small traffic violation, a woman in the courtroom, and a moment that would forever alter his perception of both justice and himself. Little did Hamilton know, his next encounter with Rosa Matthews would be the first chapter in a story of personal awakening. A challenge to everything he had ever believed about fairness, representation, and the law. The fine he'd handed down so casually that day would come to symbolize something far larger than a minor violation. It was the beginning of a journey neither he nor Rosa could have predicted. Rosa Matthews had never sought the spotlight. As the first black woman to lead a groundbreaking initiative in the federal court, she had achieved something few could even imagine, but she did so quietly, behind the scenes. Rosa's leadership wasn't the kind that garnered flashy headlines or public accolades. Instead, it was the kind that reshaped the very foundation of the legal system from the inside, creating paths where none had existed for people like her. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in a bustling city, Rosa was no stranger to adversity. She had been taught early on that success was earned, not given. Her parents, both immigrants who valued education above all, had instilled in her the belief that knowledge and perseverance could open doors even in the most unwelcoming spaces. They didn't just encourage her to dream. They pushed her to chase those dreams relentlessly, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. After graduating from a prestigious law school, Rosa initially struggled to find her footing in a legal field dominated by individuals who didn't look like her. She worked as a public defender, often handling cases that others ignored. It was in these high-pressure, emotionally charged situations that she honed her skills, learning to advocate fiercely for those who needed a voice the most. Over time, her efforts caught the attention of more senior legal figures, and she was soon recruited for a position within the federal court, a role that would change the course of her life, and in many ways, the course of the court itself. Rosa's rise to prominence within the federal court was nothing short of remarkable. She took on challenges that others avoided, pushing for reforms that many felt were unnecessary. Her approach to justice wasn't just about following the law. It was about recognizing the human element that often got overlooked. She championed diversity initiatives, focusing on making the court system more accessible to marginalized communities. Rosa believed that the judiciary could never truly be impartial if the people representing it didn't reflect the society they served. But despite her many accomplishments, Rosa had always remained a private person. She wasn't the kind of leader who sought attention or wanted to be celebrated for her achievements. Instead, she worked quietly behind closed doors, meeting with stakeholders, drafting policy changes, and spearheading training programs for judges and lawyers on issues of bias and inclusion. Her role as a trailblazer was recognized by those who knew her well, but to the broader public, she was still just a name in a press release, a leader in a system that, at best, gave her minimal acknowledgement. The weight of her responsibilities was never lost on her. Rosa often felt the strain of navigating a world where she was both an outsider and a leader, someone who had to prove her worth again and again in spaces that weren't designed for her. She had to work harder to be heard, to make sure her ideas weren't dismissed because of her race or gender. It wasn't just about advancing her career. It was about ensuring that the system she worked in could evolve to truly serve everyone. And yet Rosa didn't complain. She knew that the road she walked was not an easy one. She had been taught that the greatest impact came from persistence. Every meeting she attended, every policy she influenced, every conversation she had with colleagues was a step forward, even if it was a small one. But there were days when it felt like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. The change she was fighting for didn't always come quickly, and the resistance she faced often felt like an uphill battle. The irony of her position within the federal court was never lost on her. As she worked tirelessly to push for a more inclusive and fair judicial system, the very system she was part of often seemed to be the one standing in her way. The faces around the table, mostly white, mostly male, had no problem accepting her as a colleague, but there was always an unspoken understanding that she was a minority in more ways than one. Despite these challenges, Rosa continued to excel. Her influence began to grow, and her efforts were slowly but surely changing the course of the federal court. Through her leadership, policies were put in place to create a more diverse and inclusive environment. Legal mentorship programs for underrepresented groups were established. Training on bias and discrimination became mandatory for all court officials. These were the kinds of reforms that Rosa had been advocating for since she first stepped into the legal world, and now they were finally being implemented. Still, even as her career flourished, Rosa kept a low profile. She knew that the kind of work she was doing didn't need to be broadcast to the world. The quiet victories were enough for her. She measured her success not by how many people knew her name, but by how many lives her work had touched, by how many people had found themselves represented in a system that had never truly seen them before. But that would change. As fate would have it, her next interaction with Judge Hamilton, the one that had started with a simple traffic fine, would lead to an unexpected turning point. The judge, completely unaware of the trailblazer before him, had just unknowingly crossed paths with a leader whose influence was beginning to shape the future of the legal system. Neither of them knew it yet, but this small encounter would spark a chain of events that would challenge their perceptions and lead to a journey of mutual understanding and transformation. Weeks passed after the court appearance, and Judge Hamilton thought little more about the case. It was just another day in his busy schedule, another fine issued, another routine judgment made. Yet something in the back of his mind tugged at him, a nagging sense of familiarity with Rosa Matthews' name. He had seen her in courts, certainly, but he couldn't place why she seemed so strikingly different from the other defendants he saw on a daily basis. One afternoon, As Hamilton was going through his usual paperwork, an envelope from the Federal Court Administration caught his eye. It was a formal notification sent to all judges in the district, detailing an upcoming leadership conference focused on diversity, inclusion, and judicial reform. The letter listed a handful of key figures who had been instrumental in pushing these initiatives forward. As he scanned the list of names, his eyes landed on one: Rosa Matthews. His mind raced. Matthews. He quickly shuffled through his case files, pulling out the ticket she had been issued for the stop sign violation. The name matched. His heart skipped a beat. The woman he had fined so casually in court was none other than the woman who was leading the charge for diversity and reform within the federal court. Judge Hamilton leaned back in his chair, staring at the paper in front of him. It was almost incomprehensible. The same woman he had dismissed without a second thought was at the forefront of an initiative that could change the course of the legal system. He felt a surge of discomfort, a deep sense of unease about how he had treated her in court. There was no recognition, no acknowledgement of her leadership or her importance. His ruling had been swift, mechanical, nothing more than an ordinary decision. As he reflected on that day, his discomfort deepened. What if his actions had been influenced by unconscious biases? What if, despite his belief in fairness and impartiality, he had judged Rosa not just for a minor infraction, but because of something deeper: her race, her appearance, or the unspoken assumptions he had made based on those factors? The realization hit him hard. He couldn't just let it go. Judge Hamilton knew he had to do something. He could ignore the feeling, dismiss it as an isolated incident, but something in him told him that this moment, this recognition of Rosa's identity, was something that needed to be confronted, not avoided. Judge Hamilton sat quietly in his office, the weight of his recent discovery pressing down on him. He had been in the legal world long enough to understand the gravity of his position. He was trusted to be impartial, to represent fairness in the courtroom. Yet, as he thought back to that brief interaction with Rosa Matthews, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed in his duty. It wasn't just the fine he had issued. It was the way he had viewed her, or rather, the way he hadn't truly seen her at all. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how easy it had been to dismiss her, to reduce her to just another person with a traffic violation. He had seen Rosa as a defendant, someone caught in a mundane legal situation, not someone who was reshaping the very system he had spent his life serving. The realization was uncomfortable, even humbling. It was one thing to believe in impartiality, to follow the letter of the law. It was another to confront the possibility that his judgment had been clouded by unexamined assumptions. Hamilton wasn't accustomed to questioning his decisions. He had prided himself on his professionalism and objectivity. But now, in the quiet of his office, he wondered whether those very qualities had blinded him to the complexity of the people before him. He hadn't seen Rosa as a leader, as a person who had dedicated her life to creating change in a system that often overlooked those who were different. Instead, he had seen her as an ordinary defendant, someone who deserved a simple fine for a minor infraction. But the more he reflected, the more he realized just how much he had missed. He had dismissed Rosa without knowing anything about her background, her work, or the impact she was making on the legal system. He had let his own biases, however subtle, guide his actions. Judge Hamilton knew that he had to take responsibility for this. He couldn't ignore it, hoping it would fade away. He had to acknowledge what he had done and make amends, not just to Rosa, but to himself and the very system he upheld. The path forward wasn't going to be easy. Confronting one's own biases, especially after years of believing in one's objectivity, was a painful process. But Hamilton knew that it was necessary. If he was to continue serving as a judge, if he was to truly honor the law and the people who came before him, he needed to change. The next morning, Judge Hamilton found himself staring at his calendar, the upcoming leadership conference looming over him. Rosa Matthews' name still lingered in his mind, a reminder of his recent realizations. He had been invited to attend the conference as part of an effort to educate judges on diversity, inclusion, and systemic biases in the judicial process. The idea of attending the event felt foreign to him. He had always prided himself on the belief that his work was impartial, that he operated above such issues. Yet, as he sat there, he realized how much he had to learn. His mind drifted back to the day he found Rosa. He had been swift in his decision, not because of the law, but because he hadn't bothered to see her as an individual. He had failed to recognize the significance of the person standing before him, and instead had reduced her to an ordinary defendant. But the reality was far from ordinary. Rosa wasn't just a defendant. She was a trailblazer in the legal world, a woman who had dedicated her life to pushing for equity in a system that had too often neglected the very people it was meant to serve. Hamilton knew that he had to take responsibility for his actions, but he also knew that simply acknowledging his mistake wouldn't be enough. He needed to make things right. The first step was clear. He had to reach out to Rosa. The decision didn't come easily. He wasn't accustomed to admitting mistakes, especially not public ones. But he had learned that true leadership wasn't about maintaining a facade of perfection. It was about growth, humility, and the willingness to learn from one's errors. Reaching out to Rosa wasn't just about apologizing. It was about starting a conversation, about confronting the biases that had unknowingly influenced his actions. With a deep breath, he picked up the phone and dialed the number on the conference invitation. The call was brief, but important. He explained who he was and the purpose of his call, offering a sincere apology for his actions in the courtroom. He acknowledged that his judgment had been flawed, that he had made assumptions about her without understanding the full context of who she was and what she represented. To his surprise, Rosa answered with a calm, even tone. She listened as he spoke, and when he finished, there was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Hamilton held his breath, unsure of what she would say. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but kind. "Judge Hamilton, I appreciate your honesty," she said. "It takes courage to admit when you've made a mistake, especially in a position of authority. I'm glad you reached out." The weight that lifted off Hamilton's chest was almost immediate. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of relief. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about beginning to heal, about starting a dialogue that could lead to greater understanding. What Hamilton didn't yet realize was that this first step, this simple act of acknowledging his error, would set the stage for something far bigger than he could have ever anticipated. Following their phone call, Judge Hamilton was left in a reflective state. The conversation had been brief, but Rosa's response had opened a door he had never imagined he would walk through. Her grace in accepting his apology had startled him. There was no anger, no judgment, just a recognition of his effort to make amends. It made him realize just how rare and meaningful this opportunity for growth was. He had taken the first step, but there was still so much more to learn. In the weeks that followed, Hamilton attended the leadership conference with a sense of anticipation mixed with discomfort. He had always prided himself on his legal expertise, but now he found himself on the other side, a participant in something that challenged everything he had thought he knew about justice. The speakers at the event included a diverse array of legal professionals, judges, attorneys, and activists, who had dedicated their lives to addressing systemic bias and improving equity in the legal system. Rosa Matthews, of course, was a prominent figure at the event. She delivered a powerful keynote address on the importance of inclusivity within the court system, weaving together personal stories with an impassioned call for real, actionable change. Her words were compelling, but what struck Hamilton the most wasn't just the content of her speech. It was the way she carried herself. There was a quiet confidence about her, a strength that emanated from her as she spoke about the struggles she had faced and the triumphs she had achieved. It was evident that Rosa wasn't just a leader by title. She was a leader because she had earned it through years of perseverance and dedication. As the conference continued, Hamilton attended panel discussions and workshops that explored everything from racial disparities in sentencing to the unconscious biases that influenced judicial decisions. He was struck by the frequency with which judges and lawyers spoke about the need for self-awareness and continuous reflection. In many ways, It felt like a mirror being held up to his own career, one that forced him to confront the areas where he had failed to recognize the biases that shaped his decisions, even if those biases were invisible to him at the time. But Hamilton wasn't the only one learning. As he spent more time listening to Rosa and others who were fighting for justice, he began to understand the depth of their work. It wasn't about political agendas or radical ideas. It was about creating a legal system that was truly fair, one where everyone, regardless of their background, had an equal opportunity to be heard. Hamilton was beginning to see the gaps in the system he had once believed were imperceptible. More importantly, he was beginning to see that the work of people like Rosa Matthews was not just important, it was essential. By the end of the conference, Hamilton had changed. He wasn't entirely sure how to quantify it, but the shift inside him was undeniable. He had started with a simple apology, but now he was questioning the very framework through which he had viewed justice. And as much as he had been humbled, he realized that this was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, work he now knew he couldn't avoid any longer. Judge Hamilton returned to his courtroom with a renewed sense of purpose. The conference had left an indelible mark on him. It wasn't just the information he had learned, nor was it simply the humbling experience of confronting his biases. It was the realization that he had been given an opportunity to reshape his role, to become a more thoughtful, empathetic, and self-aware judge. It was a responsibility he couldn't ignore any longer. The first case back in his courtroom felt different. He walked in with a new perspective, more aware of the people before him. He wasn't just a figure of authority issuing rulings. He was now a person who had the power to impact lives in meaningful ways. It wasn't an overnight transformation. There were days when his old habits crept back in, when the familiarity of the law's rigidity seemed easier than questioning his decisions. But the knowledge he had gained, the conversations he had started, kept him grounded in his commitment to change. Rosa Matthews, on the other hand, had continued her work at the federal court with renewed vigor. Her leadership was now not only about policy reform, but about creating a culture that encouraged self-reflection within the legal system. She, too, had sensed a shift in the way she viewed her work. Her encounter with Judge Hamilton, though initially uncomfortable, had reminded her that change didn't happen in a vacuum. The legal system would only evolve when people in positions of power, like Hamilton, were willing to confront their own biases and question their own methods. Their paths continued to cross, at conferences, in discussions about diversity initiatives, and in quiet moments of reflection. Hamilton would reach out to Rosa for advice, seeking her input on how best to integrate what he had learned into his own work. She, in turn, respected his honesty and the efforts he was making to align his rulings with the values of fairness and inclusivity that had long been her guiding principles. Over time, their professional relationship deepened into a friendship built on mutual respect. It was a friendship that challenged both of them. Hamilton, to grow and question the assumptions he had once held so tightly, and Rosa, to recognize that even the most well-intentioned leaders could falter, and that true progress often started with uncomfortable conversations. Looking back, Hamilton knew that his encounter with Rosa Matthews had changed the trajectory of his career. What had begun as a simple traffic violation had sparked a process of self-examination that he could never have anticipated. And for the first time in years, he felt a sense of hope, not just for himself, but for the future of the legal system he had dedicated his life to serving. The work wasn't over, but Hamilton now understood that it was a journey, one that he would walk alongside leaders like Rosa, committed to making the system not just, but truly fair.